Paolo is a professor of international relations and economics at Bay Atlantic University. I usually see you in our Washington studio. Thanks so much indeed for coming in. Do you agree with just the general analysis we've been hearing from correspondents and analysts that this is the beginning of the end of the American presence and influence in Syria?
Well, yes. That I think that's pretty much a done deal. I don't see that this is going to be walked back.
In other words, troops equal influence, right? Because if there's no troops there, there's no influence.
I don't see what other... I mean, the American national security establishment, starting with former Secretary of Defense Jace Mattis, said, we're here, we're soldiers, we hold on to the territory, it's leverage, we're going to use this for future negotiations for a final settlement of Syria. If there are no troops, no leverage, what's America got left?
Do you think he has any interest in Syria's political future, which is what Presidents Erdogan, Rouhani and Putin have been talking about during the Astana process for the past few years, about how do we push this process through to find a solution?
No.
No interest at all?
That's my impression. And I, quite frankly, don't think that the American public has an interest to the extent that the President of the United States should interpret, public opinion's interest and will, whatever. Most Americans, to tell the truth, don't even know where Syria is. I'm not joking here. Let alone YPG, PKK, Erdogan, safe zones. They don't understand any of this. And I'm not saying this in contempt. I'm just saying it's so far away, so removed from the interests of the ordinary American. And when the president says, let's end all these endless commitments in faraway places where we go, destroy everything, and then we come home and things are worse than we left them, as he said in his statement just a few minutes ago. So I think Trump interprets some kind of a populist, desire of saying, let's all go home, this stuff doesn't interest us.
But there is one acronym that possibly resonates amongst Americans who don't really consider the outside world in their daily lives. The Americans call them ISIS. We call them Daesh. And Trump does want to take action against possible resurgence of Daesh. He's got a problem here at the moment, hasn't he? Saying that some of those troops in Syria at the moment are going to Iraq. Iraq has said in the past couple of hours there's absolutely no legal basis for those troops to come to our country.
Well, we'll see. I don't know if there is a compromise or anything like that may be possible. Of course, there are other American troops in Iraq who are left over, if you wish, from the occupation and from the fight against ISIL in Iraq, which, by the way, was coordinated with the Kurds, different type of Kurds from Iraqi Kurdistan. So I don't exactly know how this will be resolved, but I don't really think if they don't stay there, they'll come home or they'll be redeployed, I don't know, in Europe or somewhere else. After all, this is not big numbers. This is not like an occupation force. We're talking about 1,000 of advisors and trainers and what have you. But I, quite frankly, think that the president is intent on closing down any commitment to Syria, thinking, rightly or wrongly, that is foolish and unproductive for America to maintain any presence there, and that we have really nothing to do there. And let the people, as he says, in the region, sort it out. It's their problem. Let them sort it out.
Yeah, absolutely. He's placed a large amount of that responsibility on Turkey as well, which Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said, we're happy to accept that and we will fulfill all the obligations in terms of whatever the international community considers to be the danger from Daesh especially. Turkey has also its own particular agenda regarding its security. Paolo, to make it a bit broader, do you think Syria is just an example of a larger policy in the Middle East? People have been saying about Donald Trump that after Iran was accused of attacking those oil tankers, after it was accused of shooting down the American drone, all of these activities, which are little pinpricks towards US hegemony around the world, and especially, of course, as Iran is concerned in the Gulf, that Donald Trump lost all initiative when he failed to take action against Iran. Is he just basically slowly retreating from the whole of the Middle East because the Americans now have enough oil of their own?
Well, yes and no, because while the president hasn't taken any military action, and I would like to also underscore the small issue of the bombing of the facilities, the oil facilities in Syria, even though we technically, from a forensic standpoint, we don't know who actually did it. But the general acceptance, at least in Washington, is that the Iranians did it. Again, we don't have hard evidence on this. But don't forget the sanctions. And don't forget that America is certainly not willing, this president at the moment, to rejoin the nuclear deal, that Trump exited a couple of years ago, what was that, last year? So the effort to damage very significantly Iran economically via the sanctions remains. And I don't see that being in any way that we're going to retreat from that, unless the damage is brought to Iran, to Iran's economy, is so significant, as I think this administration hopes, that the Iranians somehow will come back and renegotiate the nuclear deal and other issues on the table about Iranians' undue influence in the Middle East. That hasn't changed, to my knowledge, in terms of policy position, but the president has also been adamant in saying, we're going to do this via sanctions. There will be no war. That, he said it repeatedly, and I would take him at his word that he's not interested in engaging the United States in another war. But to the larger point that you're making, in particular now with this sort of virtual victory for Mr. Putin due to the American retreat, and as in the American media, people described his trip to the Middle East like a victory lap, his trip to Saudi Arabia, where he was received with all the honors and all that, say, oh, this is a new era. And the traditionalists in the United States would say, look, we spent the last 30, 40 years to push the Soviet Union then and then Russia out of the Middle East, and now we're serving it to them on a silver plate, and we're exiting and they're coming in. To that, many people would say, so what? We're now the biggest oil producer in the world. America produces 12.5 million barrels of oil a day. We are the largest gas producer in the world. We're becoming net exporters. Middle Eastern oil, which was one of the main concerns, which kind of dominated, American foreign policy in the geopolitical concerns, is no longer so salient. Of course, America is still interested in the safety of delivery of oil to our allies, Japan, South Korea, India, and what have you. But it's not a burning domestic issue once we've achieved what we call hemispheric energy independence via domestic production and increased imports from Canada and Mexico. So that said, people say, so why are we so interested in the Middle East? Why should we be there and get involved in all these conflicts? Of course, one critical element that should not be forgotten is the security of Israel, which is really important for this president and for American public opinion in general.
Yeah, to the extent that Mike Pompeo said he even believed it's possible that God sent Donald Trump to Earth to save Israel. Paolo, stay there for a moment. Okay, let's play the Trump clip again, the one that's particularly relevant to Turkey and to Operation Peace Spring in northeastern Syria, and then I'll come back to you. So Donald Trump, looking at the clock, probably speaking these words about 35 minutes ago or so at the White House, talking about Washington lifting all sanctions that were imposed on Turkey earlier this month. Let's have a listen to the clip.
I've therefore instructed the Secretary of the Treasury to lift all sanctions imposed on October 14th in response to Turkey's original offensive moves against the Kurds in Syria's northeast border region. So the sanctions will be lifted unless something happens that we're not happy with. My fellow Americans, I greet you this morning from the White House to announce a major breakthrough toward achieving a better future for Syria and for the Middle East. It's been a long time. Over the last 5 days, you have seen that a ceasefire that we established along Syria's border has held, and it's held very well, beyond most expectations. Early this morning, the government of Turkey informed my administration that they would be stopping combat and their offensive in Syria and making the ceasefire permanent, and it will indeed be permanent.
Paolo, do we know any of the details about how the US president reaches these decisions? Because Donald Trump is quite particular. From almost the first day that he came to the White House, he said, I don't need any intelligence analysis. I don't even read them anyway. So what's the balance here between the man who's eventually taking responsibility for the decisions and those who are his advisors, whether they be generals, whether they be politicians, whoever?
Look, if we want to believe the inside stories, including Bob Woodward book, it looks like it's chaos. The impression that we are led to believe what's going on in the White House is chaos. That there is no order, there's no process, that stuff happens, that people are, overruled, that the president doesn't read the reports, that he does not. In other words, there's no process. The National Security Council staff has about 300 people, 200, something like that. And these people are busy writing stuff every day that then it gets to be condensed and reported and goes up the chain, and then supposedly the president gets a condensation and then policy options. Apparently President Trump doesn't read any of that.
No.
Or maybe he skims through stuff, and maybe he watches Fox News and gets his ideas from the soundbite of one expert or whoever appears on any particular show. That's what we are told. Of course, we are not there. We don't know. My office, as I was joking with one of your colleagues, is literally about 300 meters from the White House.
Right, okay.
But, maybe they don't leave the windows open, and I don't hear much of what's going on. So the reality is that he seems to make decisions just like that, on the fly. And in particular, regarding Syria, it seems like something transpired in his conversation with President Erdogan. That's the narrative. I'm not sure if it's true. And he said, okay, you want Syria? It's yours.
Okay.
We're leaving. We're getting out.
It's interesting, isn't it? He's clearly not that upset about the deal that Presidents Erdogan and Putin have done, because he said, I'm lifting all US sanctions that were imposed on Turkey on the 14th of this month. And yet you might expect someone who's so driven by his own personality to feel possibly disrespected. That, hold on, you, my friend, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, have just gone to meet one of our biggest geopolitical enemies, and you've done a deal that I'd already talked to you about when I sent Mike Pence to Ankara. He didn't even mention the Russia-Turkey deal. He's clearly not that worried about Turkey's own security, even though he mouths the words.
And he had nice words for President Erdogan in the same speech. He said, he's a good man. We work together. He said, if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to see him probably soon. Maybe he's referring to the planned but not confirmed visits to Washington that President Erdogan may actually do. So is there a method to this madness? In Washington, we're kind of used to this, whether it's on international affairs or domestic issues, these declarations and statements that come out of nowhere, and that seem to take his own staff aback. Say, oh, he said this? Who? When? What? We were never informed. This seems to be the modus operandi, and it's been going on like this for the duration of the presidency, as far as I know.
Were you in any way surprised when Turkey and Russia announced this deal to work together? And does it indicate, because I continually ask this question, and at some stage, usually on the Turkish side, people are a bit reluctant to say that, yes, I agree that possibly Recep Tayyip Erdogan is losing the trust in Donald Trump. You don't have the same affiliations with this country. Do you see any indications? We've had the S-400 missile debacle. The Americans are not allowing Turkey to buy the F-35. You go back a year, we've got the Jamal Khashoggi murder, and Turkey's been trying to bring accountability to that event inside the Saudi consulate, and the President of the United States sits there and says, maybe the CIA aren't telling the truth. I'm not sure I want to believe the CIA. Did MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, really order it? All of these different events, Pastor Brunson, who was here, held it in under house arrest in the negotiations and the threats that came from Washington. Surely there is reason for the Turkish government to say, actually, we're not sure if we really trust the guy in the White House.
I think that would be not unreasonable by anybody, whether it's the Turkish government or any other government, or quite frankly, other constituencies within the United States, because the behavior is so erratic, and one day is bad, one day is good, one day is sanctions, one day is something else, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that on this particular issue, he is saying, and he stated this much just a few minutes ago in his statement at the White House, this is great. This is good for America. It's the end of one, at least, of the endless wars. And I suspect that if you go to Middle America, in Nebraska or Iowa or Kansas, people would say, yeah, he's right. What have we got to do in those places? We don't understand anything there. We don't speak the language. These are all, people from different religions, different ethnicities. They fight their own wars. I mean, President Trump said we've been there for decades, which is rather remarkable, because that's not, at least it's a bit inaccurate. It's not true. We've been there for decades. And yet, I think that he wants to justify his own narrative, which is, I've done everything right, and there is nothing else that I should be doing. and I will, and this is a good decision, and I'm very happy that Turkey is now taking over, and if it's working with other countries, it's quite all right for me.
Okay, Paolo, you know what? We're going to work you so hard you won't want to come back to Istanbul, because we want to talk to you also about what's going on with the impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives.
That's another funny topic.
Yeah, okay, let's explain what's happened to the viewer, and I know you know it all, but, the viewer needs to be informed of the latest developments. Thanks.